Please welcome Ms. Fox.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning and to talk about education for Seapower and participate in this symposium. I think this is an incredibly timely and important topic. I think the National Defense Strategy points out DoD needs new and innovative approaches to great power competition. People, organizations who can continuously learn, evolve, and take advantage of opportunities and technologies are going to be critically important if we are to sustain our global leadership. You know, sailors and Marines today, they're more tech savvy. They have more exposure to information and influence, and they are more globally connected than in the past. Traditionally, the Department of the Navy takes these young people and turns them into skilled operators, people who are capable of flying planes, driving ships and submarines, leading troops into combat. And yes, those skills will continue to be critically important, but so too will be the ability to think critically in complex situations, adapt and incorporate game-changing technologies, communicate effectively with a broad variety of people, and continue to learn as the world changes and problems become more and more and more complex. So clearly, I think education is going to be key to the future of the Department of Defense and the Department of the Navy to sustain its edge in great power competition. And so today, we are very lucky to have with us two people who are critically important to the Department of the Navy's Education for Seapower Study, or E4S. You know, it has to be an acronym, right? E4S. Okay. Undersecretary Tom Modley, we're really happy to have you. He was the chairman of the E4S study. Undersecretary Modley serves as the Chief Management Officer and Chief Information Officer, coming from a very strong business background. For the department, his focus has been on increasing agility and accountability throughout the department. Education plays a very large role in his vision. He is a graduate of the Naval Academy, and while there, he was also able to start his work on his master's degree at Georgetown. So, Mr. Modley has experienced and benefited from the naval education system firsthand. We also have Mr. John Kroger with us today. Mr. Kroger is the Navy's new Chief Learning Officer. Mr. Kroger will lead all education efforts for the Navy and Marine Corps and implement the reforms directed by the Secretary of the Navy, many of which are outlined and recommended in the E4S study. He started his career as an NCO in the Marine Corps. With the Marine Corps' strong support, he was able to attend Yale. He has been a professor at Yale, Harvard, Lewis and Clark College, and served as president of Reed College. So he brings with him experience as an educator, a teacher, a public servant, and a Marine to this important position. So I feel very fortunate that we have these panelists with us today. I am going to start us off by asking each of them a few questions. I promise I won't take all the time because I know many of you are dying to ask them questions yourself. So once we have a little conversation up here, we'll turn it over to all of you. So be prepared to ask some questions. So first, Secretary Modley, I'd like to start with you if I could. And we just talked about the challenges of great power competition, and I was wondering if you could tell the audience in your words how you see E4S addressing those challenges and helping the Department of the Navy face both today and this complex future.
Sure. Thanks for the question, and thanks to everyone for your interest in this topic. I was at the postgraduate school last week and talking to a bunch of students, and one of the questions they asked me was, how does this sustain itself, like once you're not in the job, which could be 14 months from now or next week, we don't know. But my point, it's about creating a very large community of interest around this. Not just, leadership's really important, but having a broad community of interest that's focused on this, that cares about it. And most of these students were 03s and 04s, and I said, it's really about you. If you guys think this is important, you're going to be 06s in 5, 6, 7 years. And if you don't care about education, you're not looking at who you're promoting when you're sitting on promotion boards, it's not going to matter. So long way to get to appreciation for you being here, because I know you all have your own networks that you talk to that are affiliated with the Armed Forces and with the Navy Marine Corps team, particularly. And if you can carry this message with us, it'll have a lot more salience. Why it's important and why it's important now, I think it's probably always been important. Why it's more important now, or why it's become something that I felt was going to be one of my top priorities in this particular job, is the strategic environment that we're in. And I think that it's not wholly different from what we've experienced in the private sector, having had the fortunate experience of spending time in private and public enterprises. What we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years is very, very rapid change. It's driven by technology, but it's also driven by other things, cultural changes and things like that. And what's become sort of the defining characteristic of this is unpredictability. And so when I look at this future strategic context, I think the one thing that we can say for certain is that what is predictable is that it's going to be unpredictable. And so what gives you a competitive advantage, what can make you more able to deal with that, is your intellectual capability and your intellectual agility. And so for me, that's all about how are we educating our sailors and Marines in the Marine Corps to have that type of intellectual agility, to be able to respond to unpredictability in an era where the people that are going to be, who are, we call them our competitors, I like to call them our adversaries, because quite frankly, they are our adversaries right now. A lot of these competitors are really coming at us in every possible direction, seen and unseen. And as technology becomes more ubiquitous, I think it's going to become more even. So the difference is going to be is who knows how to use it better. And that requires thought. That requires the gray matter between the ears of the people that we ask to employ that technology into that uncertain environment. And so that's why I came into this with no preconceived notions whatsoever about what was wrong, what needed to be fixed. I had no idea. I just said, we should probably take a look at this, because the last time we really did a comprehensive look at it across the Naval Service was literally 100 years ago, in 1918, with the Knox-King-Pye report, and some of you may be familiar with it. It's cited in the E4S report, but it was the last time they really looked at it in a comprehensive way, and I thought, well, it's probably about time we take a look at that again. And instead of me digging into it myself, we impaneled some very wise people to take a look at those questions, and we said, hey, this is a clean sheet of paper. Take a look at this and look at the challenges that we have, talk to as many people as you possibly can, and come back and give us some recommendations. So that's how we ended up with the report.
Good, thank you. Mr. Kroger, I was wondering if you could, the Secretary of the Navy has assigned you many tasks in this, and I was wondering if you could talk a little about your approach to them. You've been tasked to do the new Naval Education Strategy, the Naval Educational Standards, to develop a list of approved graduate studies programs, and I think that's just to name a few.
Sure.
So you have quite a busy schedule ahead of you. I was wondering if you could share with the audience sort of how you intend to approach that. What might your priorities be from a month, 6 months, a year?
Sure. Thanks so much for hosting us today. I would say that there's sort of three big things that I'll be focusing on in the short to near term. The highest priority for me is to develop the first ever comprehensive naval education strategy, which will hopefully govern our efforts in the education space for both the Navy and Marine Corps going forward. I think the thing that is appealing to me about the E4S study was it's a very thoughtful 10,000-foot view of the direction we need to go. We need to take that then to a level where we can operationalize some of the conclusions. And I always think efforts are much more focused and directed if you're clear about what your mission is, what your strategy is going forward. So we are working hard on that. We're actually going to be circulating the very first draft to some of our partners today, with the goal of having something on the Secretary of Navy's desk late this year.
For the strategy?
Yes.
Wow,
and it is
exciting.
my hope that it may not represent ultimately a consensus, but a general shared understanding of the direction we need to go. Under that, I would say the other initiative that I think is already moving forward very quickly is the idea of creating a Naval Community College for the enlisted Marines and sailors in the force, and we can talk about that in more detail later today if people are interested. But we are in the process of classifying the positions for the president and provost of that institution, have already drafted sort of rough parameters of what it will look like, how it will operate. I'm hoping that we will be in a position to be listing those jobs and hunting for the president and the chief academic officer within the next few weeks, with the goal of getting that up and running as quickly as we possibly can. For me, that's I think it's a very important part of our strategy. It's also from a personal perspective as an enlisted Marine at the beginning of my career. There's huge capability and talent in the enlisted force, and for me, that's a great opportunity to try to invest more directly in that team's intellectual development. The last thing I would say is, and I know we'll probably talk about this in more detail, for me, I've got a lot to learn, and so I've been on an extended listening tour. I've visited all of our major naval education institutions, and next step for me will be to go visit some of our NROTC units at universities around the country. So for me, I've been very much in listening mode as I go around the country and meet with educators and with students.
Very good. Secretary Mudley, so the report has what at first blush looks like some potentially complicated reporting relationships suggested there. I know that it's not decided yet, but there's the suggestion that we need or could have a president of a new naval university. The existing organization's reporting chain doesn't change, but yet there is going to be a relationship there. There will be a relationship with the new chief learning officer. I was wondering if you could share with the audience how you've thought about what I'll call command and control of the Naval Education Enterprise, and particularly with your focus on efficiency, how you were thinking that you could make it efficient and avoid further additional bureaucracy.
Okay, so it's a really good question. The E4S report had several recommendations in it. The Secretary signed out an action memo a few weeks after the report that immediately implemented several recommendations but put others on hold for review and for further study. Probably the biggest one on that is this Naval University and the structure of the Naval University, where it might be located, who would lead it, et cetera. The E4S board recommended that it would be co-located and co-vested in the presidency of the Naval War College with a uniformed person. And so that was something that neither I or the Secretary were in complete agreement with at the time. So we decided to sort of table that and allow our Chief Learning Officer to think about that and talk more to the organization to try and deconflict the types of things you're talking about. So right now, the way that we're thinking about it is one of the problems that we had, that we recognized through the study, was the lack of visibility and transparency into the dollars that we're spending on education. Mm-hmm. It's very hidden, very distributed, and it mostly rested in the N1 organization in OPNAV. And if you look at their pie chart of their budget, there's about a 35% slice of that budget that's called trade space, and there's a little arrow that says education. It's like, so that tells me that, you know, it was not in the right place in the organization. It was not prioritized, it was not elevated. Through no fault of their own, they just had competing priorities with training and other things. So step one is to carve that budget out and isolate it so that myself, the Secretary, the CNO, the Commandant, and our Chief Learning Officer have visibility into those numbers so that we can help drive that. So the ultimate structure is going to try and clean all this up rather than make it more complicated. We're creating an N7 organization for education and experimentation. That's likely will become the resource sponsor for the Navy side. The DC CDI for the Marine Corps is where that's going to be. And if you look at the governance structure that's being put in place underneath that, it's going to be it's going to be populated by very, very senior people in the Navy helping to make decisions on what we're doing on education. So I think it's much more obtuse now than the ultimate end state. And that's what we're trying to get to, much more clarity on command and control and much more elevated visibility into what we're doing in education. So that's the ultimate goal. And John, I don't know if you want to talk more about Naval University and what we're thinking about that. We're still going to go forward with the Naval University. The questions of command control of that are still under debate and discussion. So, yeah.
Sure. I guess I would say, having spent over 30 years in and out of federal and state government, I think sometimes we can focus more on the bureaucratic structure and less on the overall goals. And for me, my biggest goal is to have a strategy that sets forth very clearly what we're trying to achieve. I think that kind of intellectual alignment makes up often for the sheer complexity of the organizations that we would have. I think for me as an educator, the one thing I would say is I like the idea of the institutions having a fair amount of independence and flexibility. I think we should be clear about what our goals are, where their mission fits into those overarching goals. But I do not want to be in a position where we're trying to micromanage the particular operations of the institutions. We have very fine educational institutions. The leaders of those are very senior folks. We're going to be hearing from some of them today. And so I think what's important is to make sure that we're all aligned in terms of what we're trying to achieve, and then give them the space and the resources they need to achieve that.
I think that in the past, there were decisions made on budgets for the Naval Academy, for the postgraduate school, that were being made at levels that were not getting visibility at the secretariat level, at the senior levels of the secretariat. And we just have to, that has to be broken. Those types of decisions need to be elevated to the most senior levels, and they simply just were not. And so, the institutions would submit their budgets, they'd get 75% of that, and they say, good luck with that. Well, that's not prioritizing, and that's not leveraging across the educational base that we have. So.
Well, as Director Cape, I ran not one, not two, but 3 efficiency reviews for the department. So I applaud your goals and this and the perspective of having a strategic focus and bringing things up to senior people for priority. Let me just ask you both one last question before I turn it over to the audience, if I could. When I read E4S, it's a very comprehensive look at the internal naval education structure of the Department of the Navy. I didn't see a lot of talk in there about the importance or the thinking about collaboration with other institutions and how you might want to think about that, as certainly in an age where innovation is key and people tend to see that collaboration is a key to innovation. How do you think about the naval education continuum as being a part of a collaborative ecosystem, if you will? Secretary Monley, let me start with you.
Yeah, well, so I think that's, step one of that is with our own institutions, is how do we get them to collaborate more? I think we're in a great place right now. The leadership that we have at the War College and at the Academy and at the postgraduate school and Marine Corps University, they've already started this process now. They recognize that this is now prioritized by the Secretary, myself, and others, and that's starting to happen. But I think part of the value of creating this Naval University system is to encourage that level of collaboration, but also extend it outside the walls of the Navy. John's having been a president of a college, he understands that, and I think that's one of the mandates that we've given him is how do we take this Naval University and then build relationships, partnerships, collaboration with other universities, public universities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple examples of ways in which I think we'll have close collaboration between our strategy and our institutions and civilian higher education. One is in the area of the community college. I expect that our civilian partners will deliver probably 95% of the courses. So the structure that we've imagined for the institution is to deliver that content online. Most of the majors are going to be in core areas where we think the education will be valuable for the individual sailor and Marine, but also really important for our forces. Areas like cyber, computer science, data analytics. We don't need to reinvent the wheel in terms of delivering really high quality educational programs in those areas. We've got great universities and community colleges that already do that. So we're going to work with our partners for a lot of that course delivery. I would say that there is immense value to having a subset of our officer corps attend civilian institutions. And as we increase the number, I hope, of officers who are going through graduate programs, I hope part of that increase will be to distinguished civilian institutions. I think you can overstate it, but there's some degree of risk of a civil-military intellectual divide. I think civilians think about problems, talk about problems very differently than we do in the armed forces. I think it's really important that officers have a chance to really be educated alongside civilian peers, so that when we're communicating at a national level about strategic goals or means of carrying out those goals, that there's a greater shared understanding of how each other thinks. And finally, I would say that there's very specific projects where I hope we will enlist colleagues and peers in civil universities. I was at Harvard and MIT last week discussing some of those partnerships. Areas like wargaming, there's very sophisticated things that are going on in some of our universities that I think we could tap into. Really deep understanding, particularly in great graduate schools of education, about what we've learned about learning science and pedagogy that I think we could incorporate more into our educations. So I think we're hopefully going to build a lot of rich pathways for cooperation.
Do you find receptivity when you're going out?
100%.
Excellent.
100%. I think there are a lot of people in American higher education who are deeply committed to the country and the country's future, think that they will benefit from participating in that dialogue. They understand that the problems we work on have real-world consequences. People in higher education want to make a difference, and this is a great potential partnership where they can magnify the impact they have on the world. And for a lot of scholars, that's a really attractive value proposition. So I'm hoping that we will see a great deal of collaboration.
I've had the exact same experience. I've probably been to 10 or 15 different universities in the last year, a couple of them in places, like my hometown in Cleveland. I visited Cleveland State and Case Western Reserve, and they're all like, hey, we read the E4S report, how can we get involved? How can we help you? We'd like to be engaged in this. And it's, some of these places are doing really, really interesting things that have high applicability for what we need in the Navy and Marine Corps team. And so I've seen another example. It was probably a week or so, Steve knows, a week or so after the report came out, we got the letter from Old Dominion University, and they want to be our first partner on the Naval Community College. And so Steve went down there. Steve's back there, he's the Deputy Chief Learning Officer, and he went down there and met with several universities involved. So we're reaching out to San Diego with the same type of thing. So I've seen nothing but enthusiasm and receptivity to this concept.
And I would add to that. I was teaching at Harvard last year and became aware of the Education for Seapower report long before I had any idea that I would actually have anything to do with implementing its findings. Similarly, my wife works in higher education and sent me an email that colleagues had reached out to her. Excited about some of the things that we are doing around sexual assault prevention. And for me, that degree of sort of interpenetration is pretty remarkable. I think people in civilian higher education are interested in what we are doing, that are interested in helping.
Excellent. All right, very good. Thank you both. I would now like to give our audience the opportunity to ask some questions. So who would like to go first? I think we have 2 stand mics. Do we have passing mics as well, or just the stands? Just standing mics. Excellent. All right, please.
Good morning. Joint staff. Thank you very much for being here this morning. Your presentation seems to very much emphasize technology, cyber, data science. Another side of education.
Thank you. Another important side of education is the humanities, cultural. In the past, our great power competitors we had at least some kind of loose cultural, historic ties, and we had some similarities. China's our new main competitor. Today, even some of our most educated, and I would consider myself, that we have a lack of understanding of their history, of their culture, where they're coming from. So this part of education for Seapower, is there going to be a cultural, historic, strategy, policy side of it, or are you satisfied that we're heading in the right direction in those areas? Thank you.
Well, I'm a little disappointed that you think that's what the emphasis of the report was, because it's really not. Clearly, investing in science and technology education is going to be critical. It's critical to everything that we're going to be doing in the future. But the balance of the report was really about creating critical thinking. And how do we create critical people who can be adept at critical thinking and dealing with uncertainty. And you're talking to a political science major here from the Naval Academy, and even though I was a political science major, I took much more science and engineering than I took political science. So finding that right balance, and there's been a lot of studies written on this in terms of how the Naval Academy particularly has sort of waxed and waned between emphasis on social sciences and humanities and science and technology. It's a balance. We have to have both. And that requires, that's not something that's natural to people. That's why education is so important. And how do we embed that type of thinking into the people that we ask to go do these very, very hard jobs? And so, yes, I completely agree with you. We have to do a much better job of understanding. Part of being a good competitor, dealing with a very sophisticated adversary, is understanding them. And so we have to do a much better job at that.
Yeah, our education strategy is going to identify 4 or 5 sort of key areas where we think we have a lot to gain by greater focus, and one of those is geopolitical sophistication, understanding of our not just of our potential adversaries, but our allies and partners as well. I think as we move forward, you'll see, I don't think of this as an either or. I don't think it's a question of, are we going to be more technologically sophisticated or have more of a humanities focus? I think we're going to have to do both. I come from a humanities background. I value it tremendously in terms of its ability to train people, not just to be critical thinkers, but creative problem solvers. At the same time, we're going to have very specific direct needs. In terms of our understanding of technology, its capabilities, and its limits. So I hope you'll see a focus on both moving forward.
There's a very good, I just mentioned this last night, I was talking to a Naval Academy Alumni Association group. It's an article about the erosion of trust in large organizations, particularly, large organizations, so large corporations, large government institutions. The fallout of that, I think we're seeing around the world, and sort of things like Brexit and other political turmoil. But they talk about trust, and the 2 things that help to create trust in organizations are technical competence, understanding science, technology, all those things that are important, but also something called social competence. And without those 2 working together, it's very, very difficult to build an organization that can be competent in all dimensions and build trust both internally and externally. And so education is critical to helping create people that can do both of those things.
Good morning. I'm Commander Brooke Millard, U.S. Coast Guard, and currently a fellow at the Naval Institute. And my question's for Mr. Kroger. I'm curious, Dr. Fox mentioned that you have quite a few taskers from the Secretary of the Navy, and one of them is to include learning as a category, a performance criterion on the officer fit rep. And I'm wondering how, or maybe this is enlisted as well, but I'm wondering how someone might score high in that category outside of the brick and mortar type of learning that we're looking for.
Sure. So the N1 is actually at work as we speak on what that language in the fitness reports will look like. The way I conceive of it is there are really 2 separate categories by which we should consider whether a particular officer has advanced education. One is the degree to which they've pursued during the reporting period educational opportunities for themselves. And second, and for me this is probably even more important, the degree to which they've supported the educational development of the men and women that they command or supervise. So it is my hope that what, as commanding officers are rating the men and women they command, they will be thinking about both of those dimensions, because I think it's not enough for an officer to pursue their own education. It's very important that they support the deepening intellectual development of the people that serve under them. I think there are lots of ways in which someone can pursue education at different levels. I'm hoping, one, that we will give a clear menu of options to officers and commanders, so as they're thinking about how they're going to develop intellectually during the period, the next period of their career, they will have a better understanding of the options that are available. And second, I think we're going to have to create more meaningful and available options, particularly in the intermediate period of an officer's career. I think if you look, particularly on the Navy side, we've got very high quality undergraduate education, immediate training for one's specialty, whether a pilot or a surface warfare officer. And then at the end, we've got outstanding strategic education at the War College and through partners like SICE. The question is, what does that intermediate space look like? And I'm hoping that we will develop a more robust intermediate warfighting curriculum for officers who are in the sort of senior 03, 04 level on the Navy side, something equivalent to what the Marine Corps has pursued with their Expeditionary Warfare School and command and staff. So a more formalized curriculum that's available in non-brick and mortar options, right? So I think I was thinking about the report that Christine worked on in 2007, and one of the key things that we always struggle with, particularly for pilots and for submariners and in other communities, is how can you get them out of their operational billets into an educational opportunity. And one of the things that's really changed dramatically is how we understand education delivery since 2007. If you look at, in civilian terms, we think of it mostly as executive education, where you're spending a small amount of time on campus doing a lot of work with your cohort away from campus. Something like that makes education much more accessible to people in communities where we've traditionally had a hard time prying them out of a cockpit and getting them into a classroom. So I'm hoping we'll have a clear set of options that are world-class for people to pursue.
Thank you.
And a lot of this about, just a lot of this about how do we build this into an officer's development or an enlisted person's development. We don't really have to reinvent the wheel, because the Marine Corps has been doing this now. Sort of this revolution that General Gray and General Krulak brought into the Marine Corps, creation of Marine Corps University, the amount of time and that they've dedicated to the education of their officers, I mean, it's been pretty remarkable. And so there's a lot of lessons we can learn from one of the services that we have responsibility for.
And Brooke, thank you for the compliment, but sadly I don't have a PhD. My failing, of course, in this education discussion, but I'm going to take advantage of my interruption here to just ask one quick follow-on question about the delivery of education. But I believe I saw in E4S that for the most senior officers, they will need to have an in-residence graduate degree. Is that correct? So what is it you're thinking about the distinction there for the importance of in-residence versus the importance of providing graduate opportunities differently, more distributedly for everyone else?
So I would say I'm a big fan as an educator for in-residence. It disrupts your sort of day-to-day. It disrupts your day-to-day focus on the job at hand, gives you the space and the time for reflection. It's really important. But I would say that we shouldn't view this again as because we value that so much, we shouldn't view that as restricting our options. at the University of Pennsylvania. She spent 3 days a month on campus. And when we went into that program, we're both educators. We had a little, frankly, degree of skepticism about the quality and intensity of the educational experience. It was remarkable. And what I took away from that experience was that even though we value in-residence education very highly, for people who are in the early and intermediate phases of their career, it's just not going to be an option for all of them to pursue an in-residence education. I think that's one of the lessons I think we've learned from the Marine Corps. Even with very high in-residence rates, they have used executive education and blended education very effectively. And so for me, again, it's not an either or. It's different delivery platforms that we'll use to reach different populations of our officer corps.
Thank you.
Hi, Ryan Evans, War on the Rocks, your editor most recently. How do you, and this is a related question, how do you view the different roles, and this is something discussed in E4S a lot, different roles for certificate education and accredited education?
I'll let you take that one.
Sure. So I would say, all of our institutions need to be accredited. I'm a former accreditor. I actually believe in the accreditation process, and I think our military institutions have benefited greatly, particularly in terms of how civilian universities and colleges view them because they're accredited. But I would say not every educational experience needs to lead to a degree. I certainly think that it's important for our people who are heading into senior leadership to take time to have an in-residence strategic education that will be associated with a degree. But I think what we really should be measuring, particularly earlier in a career, is the degree to which we're delivering very relevant, valued education. Hopefully that will stack in people's careers that may lead to a degree. But the content, the focus for us should be on what are people learning and how does that make us more effective as a force. Pursuing a degree in itself should not be the end goal. What we should really be focusing on are specific learning outcomes that we're hoping to achieve. And then we should be trying to measure the extent to which the educational experiences that we're offering are achieving those goals.
Captain Brian Lease, I'm from the National Intelligence University in Bethesda, Maryland. I have a question about JPME and how in this vision, especially of the Naval University, are you going to handle the JPME requirements as constrictive as they are?
I know you thought about that in the report.
Yeah, we addressed it in the report. There's a lot of work going on at the OSD level as well to look at JPME and looking at revising it. I think Secretary Mattis has quoted many times about how he feels that current JPME is stagnant and needs to be relooked at. So we are looking at that as well as part of this process to determine how does it fit in, does it fit in, and that's part of what I think John's working on as part of the educational strategy.
Yeah, so we will be forming a working group within the Navy and Marine Corps, both to figure out what within current constraints we can do to deliver more effective education, but also to have proposals to take to the DoD level. Now that we have many years of experience with joint planning and preparation for joint planning, there's probably some ways in which the current requirements can be updated. I think one of the things we've concluded is that we'd like JPME 1 to come earlier in careers of Navy and Marine Corps officers. One of the experiences that I think we saw in Afghanistan in particular is that people were being thrown into joint roles much earlier in their careers than one might expect. And so one answer is to deliver that earlier in people's careers. Hopefully we will be bringing the Secretary and Undersecretary some proposals for changes to JPME sometime in the first quarter, probably, of next year.
Rick Easton, retired surface warfare officer. Mr. Secretary, Mr. Kroger, thanks very much for your update today. I found it very interesting, and the whole study is very interesting. I've got two questions in the context of if we have to, we need to fight and win against a peer competitor. The first has to do with the continuum of manpower, personnel, training, and education. So we've talked about strategic education. I know that's a principal focus, and I'm certainly a full supporter of that as an individual that was able to do a lot of that during my Navy career. But how does that cross the boundary? And you, of course, talked about the new enlisted community college thought process. I think it's a great idea. But how does that come down to training, as we then have to employ very complex and ever more complex systems effectively in battle with what I would consider today to still be a very legacy manpower personnel system? So we're still detailing. I mean, if you're in the fleet, you can't get somebody from the Bureau in less than a year. All of those things have to be, if you have shortfalls, solved at the waterfront, which of course reduces the readiness of somebody else at the expense of the guy that's going forward. That's just an example. So did you look at this manpower personnel training and education and how it flows down to the training piece that becomes so important at the tactical level? So we're talking about strategic education. Obviously, there's a strategic and an operational and a tactical level of war. They all have to come together. So that's one question, the MPT&E. The second question is from a funding perspective. Certainly in my career, which was the mid-'70s to the mid-2000s, and in Admiral C.N.O. Clark's revolution in training, and then now what I see in Sailor 2025 and Ready Relevant Learning, in both of those cases, there were bills to be paid, quote unquote. So one of the questions is why was the money hidden, period, across MPT&E? It's because I think not necessarily that was with malice aforethought, but as we keep cutting, then we go put Band-Aids on and try and fix different things, and of course money comes from different places. So one of the concerns, though, is that as you gather all the money together, then does it become a target and be reduced? My personal view is that as we fight the next war, that training may be much more important today, particularly with the simulation and other things we have. So anyway, those are the two questions, the money and the MPT.
Okay, let me hit the money question.
Yep.
So the money question is no different than any other money question. It's about prioritization and risk. And what we've discovered is that in the process of determining what we're funding in education, it was just low on the priority side because it was considered low risk not to short the money there. Someone has to make, there sort of has to be an inflection point that says, no, we're not doing that. We're not going to sacrifice education. It's a priority for us, and therefore it's going to get funded fully. That's a big cultural change. I recognize that. Right now, I think we're fortunate because the Secretary believes in it, I believe in it, the CNO believes in it, the Commandant of the Marine Corps believes in it, and so we have a period of time here where we can start trying to impact that culture. But just like I told these 04s and 03s last week, if they don't believe in it, they're going to change it anyway. So you have to build a broad coalition of support for this type of thing, and generally speaking, that happens when things are shown to be sort of unassailable from a logical perspective, but also the results. If the results are demonstrating that this is making a difference in the quality of the people that we have, on their ability to handle and deal in these unpredictable and uncertain circumstances, then it'll continue.
So I would say I view training and education as being on the same spectrum. I don't view them as being two radically different things. But historically, when we've lumped them together, training budgets have swallowed, if you will, education budgets. So I think there's some real value to having some separation so that we can think more clearly about what we're spending on education, why, and what we get for it. It's interesting, right? Training is going to get even more complex going forward. Right, it's very possible, particularly on the Navy side, that we're going to see smaller crews, right? And so people are going to have to be multidisciplinary sailors that are cross-trained in a host of things. One of the things I think you get from basic foundational education is you learn how to learn. And so when I think about the value of, say, the community college to the Navy and Marine Corps, part of that is, right, I think it's going to have a tremendous impact on recruiting and retention, but it's going to build those basic learning and analytic and communication skills. And as warfighting gets more complicated, I think we're going to see a direct benefit there. I would also say a lot of things that, it's interesting. A lot of things that might get labeled as education have huge implications operationally, and so I think it's a mistake to view education as a sort of an abstract experience you have. It's your time as an egghead away from the real work of warfighting. I was up at Lincoln Labs at MIT looking at some of the wargaming possibilities technologically. Those war games, if you go through them, and we've run through a group of students at the War College through one of the prototypes, they really make you think about what you're doing and why. But you can run through a particular operational scenario 50 times, right, in an afternoon, right? The impact in terms of being able to conceive of and try out various different operational possibilities is remarkable. So as I think about education, I think people need to recognize that if done properly, it has huge operational relevance.
There's huge tremendous opportunity right now to leverage technology and training to reduce the cost of training and reduce the risk. I went out to the LCS trainer out in San Diego, and it's unbelievable. Like it's not full motion, but it feels like it's full motion, and it's not the bridge. It's like there's this whole section of it where they're teaching sailors how to deploy a rigid, boat off the back using davits and everything. It's all virtual. They can go out there and they can run 50 simulations in a morning, right? Not 1 ounce of fuel has been burned. No one's life is put at risk. They can run them through emergency scenarios that they can't really replicate when they're out at sea. I mean, it's unbelievable. Same thing that I saw at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. They're building a new medical school now, and they're using all HoloLens technology, where they're not going to have any medical cadavers in their medical school anymore. You put these things on, there's a human body in front of you, and you can basically walk inside that human body with this and look around at everything that's in there, and that's how they're teaching anatomy now for the first time. So there is so much out there, and this is what the value is. We're trying to emphasize this, create this university system, connect with other universities that are doing innovative things that we think, hey, maybe that could be relevant for us in a different way, and drive down the cost of training. So,
I think we
Thank
have
you.
time for one more question.
Surely. Robbie Harris, a former naval person. I read the paper when it came out in April, May, whenever, but that was then. Please remind me, what is the problem statement? What is the problem that E4S is designed to solve or fix?
So I think I tried to answer that at the beginning. I think that we're entering into a very different strategic context, and where, as I mentioned, unpredictability is what we need to be preparing for. And so the problem that we tried to address was the open question was, does our educational system in the Navy, is it adequately prepared for building the type of intellectual agility that we need to have in our officers and our enlisted people? That's the open question. As I mentioned, it was a blank sheet of paper. They went out, looked at the question, and said, probably not. We probably need to make some changes to address that, and that's what E4S is trying to do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I would like, before we close, to give each of you just the chance, one last thought. What would you like to say, Mr. Cremers? One last thought.
The simple thing I would say, and it's the reason I took this job, I fundamentally believe that great education in the Navy and Marine Corps is vital to national security. I think we, for a long period of time since the end of the Cold War, have had major economic and technological advantages over potential adversaries. In 1995, our technological edge was massive over any possible adversary. Our economy was 10 times the size of China's. Our nearest economic competitors were Japan and Germany, which were close allies. And you fast forward today, and a lot of those advantages have really narrowed, if they have not disappeared. There are key areas technologically where we are behind potential adversaries, and economically we're really dealing with potential adversaries who are economic peers. So when you think about that competitive environment, where does your edge come from? And I believe fundamentally, we're not going to outfight people. We're not going to be a credible deterrent force unless we're intellectually prepared. And for me, that is a real calling, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to come in and try to help the Navy and Marine Corps team get to where it wants to be.
Thank you.
And I would just echo that, but also just to say that I think this is going to be critical for the future of the Navy and Marine Corps team and its ability to operate in this future environment. I think we're shifting towards this focus on great power competition. It's a nice buzzword or a buzz phrase, but all the stuff on the other end of the spectrum isn't going away either. And so we need to have a force that's able to deal with uncertainty across that broad range of competitors, adversaries, et cetera. And the best way that we can do that is invest in their intellectual capacity. And so that's what this is about.
So my closing remark is to just simply say thank you very much to both of you for being with us this morning. It's a great conversation, and thanks to the audience for the great questions. So thank you very much.
On behalf of the Naval Institute, we want to thank Ms. Fox, Undersecretary Modley, and Chief Learning Officer John Kroger. Give you each a copy of our Naval Institute press book, Learning War. We know your time is precious, and we thank you very much. Again, let's give them another hand.
This will be my second copy, so I'll pass it on to a colleague.
Okay, we've got a 15-minute break here to reset, and we'll start back at 10:15. Thank you very much.